Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. All right, today I'm sitting down with Tobias Harris. He's the founder and principal of Japan Foresight, a consulting firm. He's an expert on Japanese domestic politics, and he wrote the book on Shinzo Abe, the iconoclast. Tobias, thanks for sitting down with us today.
Great to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's talk about the thing, as you just said. I tried to get you to narrow it down, but you said, no, the thing. I think we all know what thing we're talking about here. So far for Japan, they have relatively stayed out of the so-called crosshairs. Target so far has been Canada, Mexico, Europe. Japan has sort of been on the sidelines to that point. So when we talk about how Japan is responding to what we've seen in the first month or so, give or take, how do you size up Japan's response, and how are they internalizing what they've seen to this point?
Well, it's interesting. So I've been here for just over 2 weeks now, and in some ways, there's been a dividing line in my trip between before the Zelensky meeting at the White House and after the Zelensky meeting at the White House, where in conversations before the meeting, there was still a sense that, well, the summit went well, but of course we know that that doesn't solve everything, and of course we've seen tariffs, and we're trying to figure out what that's actually going to mean. A kind of a recognition, as someone told me, that this is still in the early innings. They use the baseball metaphor. Over the last week, where the impact and the significance and the messaging that came out of that meeting after that was absorbed, the tone of my conversations has been a little more pessimistic, and sort of a recognition that even if the Trump administration's attention is more on Europe, more on North America, that Japan is not going to stay out of the spotlight forever, that Asia is not going to stay out of the spotlight forever. At some point, we're going to get more of a sense of what the administration wants to do in Asia. But meanwhile, the message about what this administration intends for world order became very apparent in that meeting. And so I think the alarm, the sense that things really are on the brink of changing, was much more pronounced last week than the previous week. And of course, to bear that out, last week we saw Trump talk about the yen being too weak, talk about how asymmetrical the U.S.-Japan alliance is. You had
tariffs are still out there.
Tariffs are still out there, and we'll know more obviously in the next few days whether exemptions are a realistic possibility. I mean, I'm skeptical about that. We can talk about that separately maybe, but you also got Elbridge Colby, of course, saying Japan has to raise its defense spending to 3%. So definitely a sense, not only do we have a clearer sense of what Trump might want to do for the world, but also maybe we're creeping back into the spotlight.
So stepping back a little bit, Japan under Shinzo Abe was seen to be one of the countries that was quote unquote more successful at handling Trump, or at least deflecting some of the potential blows. And one of the things I noticed myself in the lead up to not just the election, but afterwards, of course, was a certain confidence about how the bureaucracy, about how the government could manage a possible second Trump administration. So two-part question. One, did you notice the same degree of confidence? And two, is that confidence flagging? Or do they still feel, as far as you can tell, do they still feel like they can manage this, that they can hold off the most challenging threats?
So I was here also in November, right after the election, and was trying to get a feel for, did they think that they could just kind of rerun the Abe playbook again? And I was actually encouraged at the time in that it didn't seem like that was their idea, that they recognized that Trump was not the same that that he was in 2016, 2017. And that Ishiba is not Abe. His domestic political situation is completely different. He's just a different kind of politician. His personality is different. Abe in 2016 was probably, that was probably the peak of his power. There was probably not a moment when he was stronger. And Ishiba very much in a different circumstance domestically.
First minority government in 30 years?
Exactly. And and just just a little more hamstrung at home. And so, I think there was a recognition that it wasn't going to be exactly the same. That said, I mean, I think the focus on getting him, an early summit does tell you it's not even so much, the Abe playbook as just this long-standing recognition that, first and foremost, the Japanese prime minister has to get on the same page with the U.S. president.
Of course.
That's Japanese prime minister doesn't have too many fundamental tasks, but that's one of them. So I think you can maybe look at it even more like that than, hoping that this is going to be, a new bromance between, Trump and Ishiba. That wasn't the goal. The goal was something more basic than that. I mean, clearly, the sense from, politicians, from bureaucrats, I mean, there is a recognition that they're going to be white knuckling things a little more. That this is not something that's just going to be sorted out by, well, if we just get them in the room enough, they'll trust each other, and that'll spare us from the things they want to do. I think they're also, one thing that I think is very clear from my conversations, that there's a real appreciation for what's happening inside the U.S. and an appreciation that has implications for how it's acting overseas, and that in some ways the sources of risk from the Trump administration have more to do with U.S. domestic politics than, specifically, the bilateral content.
Could you unpack that a little bit? Because usually when we talk about risks that the Trump administration may pose to Japan, you think of tariffs, obviously. You think about hitting hard on currency issues or something like that. Questions about defense, nuclear umbrella, that kind of thing. But it's very much a stops at the water's edge kind of scenario. Japan is worried about its own implications, but not so much about the internal U.S. implications. Is that changing? Is that what you're seeing?
I think they're paying very close attention to what's happening to the federal government. I think the attack on USAID was not missed. I think and the implications of that, just in general, the kind of attacks on the capacity of state capacity of the United States, and scientific research, the investing climate. There's just lots, a sensitivity that a lot of the risks of what the administration is doing, reach well beyond the United States.
Yeah.
And and a sensitivity that there's real downside now, even if Japan would essentially be, sort of collateral damage, but that Japan has a lot at stake. And in some ways we've already heard something to this effect from Ishiba. Last week, saying that tariffs could lead to Japan to reconsider its FDI in the United States. There's a real consciousness of what the United States is doing, what Trump is doing in the United States. Really, and I think for me, I think back to how the Japanese media responded to January 6th.
Right.
Like the response to that was really like this is a shame before the entire world. So there's not, at least among elites here, they're not in the dark about what's happening in the United States. The news is covering it very closely. They know what's going on, and one thing that I've tried to do in conversations is get people to sort of stretch their imaginations a little bit.
Yeah.
But it doesn't take a lot of effort. People are very aware of what's happening.
So, how do I frame this exactly? Is there a constituency for what Trump is doing in Japanese government or in Japanese politics? Do you look at the right-wingers in the LDP or just beyond? Is there a constituency who says, we don't love what's happening with Doge, we don't love what happened to USAID, but the son of a gun's going to be tough on China and he's going to be tough on North Korea, and we're good with that? Who are the MAGA hats in Nagatacho, I suppose?
The name that comes to mind, Takaichi Sanae, defending the idea of America first. Of course, America first. Every country puts its people first. And disagree with her interpretation of what that means, because it basically just means America alone and forget everyone else. I feel like I have not heard a lot of people saying, what I think people had hoped during the transition was going to be, the potential upside. That it ends up ultimately looking a lot like the first term in that they're going to put competition with China first.
Yeah.
And that means they'll see us as important. There are plenty of China hawks around. Like clearly, maybe there's going to be some moments, some uncomfortable moments, but we can rely on that. But I think the White House meeting with Zelensky was so important in showing that that competition with China is not actually first and foremost, and I haven't really heard anyone saying, "Oh, well, maybe we'll get a reverse Kissinger out of this." It seems like two strong countries ganging up to pressure, a country that had been invaded, has been fighting for its life. I think there's a lot of concern about what exactly he's going to do with Taiwan. I think there's a lot of concern about what exactly he intends to do with North Korea. And I personally, I think it's not all that hard to imagine, a situation where you substitute North Korea for Russia and South Korea for Ukraine, and
I think the parallels are obvious, and I think that's what's driving a lot of the shock. You've had higher level conversations than I have, but I think that Zelensky meeting created the question: if you can do this to Ukraine, a country that was obviously invaded, then what does that mean for Taiwan? What does that mean for the Senkakus? What does that mean for South Korea? Yeah. So even among China hawks here, they're thinking, oh, if they can be thrown under the bus, so can we.
Yeah, and I think that's also another way in which the domestic politics plays into this. And this is what I've been stressing a lot of my conversations, that ultimately I think this administration cares much more about a radical transformation of American government and American society, and sort of everything is secondary to that, which means that if making peace enables it to focus on its domestic agenda, then it will Trump will declare peace and bring troops home and stop spending on ungrateful allies.
We don't have troops in Ukraine.
I know.
I'm not directing that at you.
Yeah, other places where we have where there are U.S. troops overseas, and they are pledged to defend.
Think of a couple of those in the region.
You don't have to walk too far from where we're sitting to find them. And that, there is that connection between costly, politically costing a lot of political capital agenda they're pursuing at home that is going to that certainly people in the administration are very committed to, and clearly don't want any foreign engagement or entanglement to derail that. And clearly, I think it should at least give people pause here that this is not an administration that is organized around the idea of strategic competition with China.
Yeah. So let's go back to the question of political capital, because I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, I think one of the advantages that Abe had in dealing with Trump was that he was just so darn safe politically that he could sort of overextend himself. He could wear the hats, he could do the burgers, he could fall into a sand trap on the golf course. And he kind of knew that, sorry for referencing that, but he could sort of embarrass himself to a degree and survive it politically, because who was going to challenge him? Who was going to challenge him in the LDP? Who was going to challenge him outside of the LDP? Ishiba, obviously, you don't have that. When you're in charge of a minority government as an unpopular leader, you just can't take that many risks. You can't absorb that many blows. So, again, continuing the theme of a two-part question, is that fair to say that Ishiba cannot overextend himself? And then second part, where does the Japanese public stand on Donald Trump? Because for guys like Justin Trudeau, who will now be stepping down, I shouldn't date the podcast, but Justin Trudeau is stepping down as prime minister. For a lot of European leaders, I think they get a lot of political capital out of standing up to Trump. Is that the same in Japan?
It's all. That's not really even a two-part question. That's just all one big question. So we'll just kind of take it all.
Put it together.
Clearly, the expectations for Abe were, you've got to do whatever it takes to keep the U.S. engaged, and therefore he did have a certain latitude to do whatever it takes, including like interminable phone calls where Trump would talk endlessly about Pearl Harbor. Like if that's what, if that's what you had to do, like that's
right.
And I think I wish I could find the source, but there was some sort of interview that Abe did after he left office, and or maybe it was a speech he gave, and I've saved the citation somewhere and I've not been able to find it. But he basically said, like, of course I wasn't trying to be his best friend. I was doing whatever I had to do to defend Japan. Like
it's
just sort of
diplomacy.
like I had to like put up with some stuff, but it was worth it. And I mean, clearly, we have seen prime ministers who can't get the relationship with the United States right pay a real price for that.
Yeah.
So I mean that that has been the expectation. I think the question now is whether, not that I expect that the public wants Ishiba, any Japanese leader, to act to stand in defiance of Trump in the way that Canadian
like a
leaders,
Justin Trudeau style.
Yeah, I mean I don't know if the public is prepared for that. The question is, though, is there a line at which the demands from the United States become so egregious, or like the prospect of sort of a U.S.-Russia
condominium,
carving up the world, like that, just like where there's a line at which the public says, you know what, like this is exactly like maintaining this relationship in this way is requiring us to compromise who we are too much, and therefore like maybe it is time, like not in a like defiant, oppositional defiant kind of way where you're making a big show of it, but where there's not the same reward for placating the United States.
Because to be fair to Canada and the European Union, Canada, Trump is threatening annexation. We can talk about whether he's serious or not, but he's threatening annexation. Like, yeah, that'll rile up a public. Talk about the EU, United States, according to a lot of people over there, is switching sides from Ukraine to Trump. These are, big existential challenges. Japan so far is like, okay, currency, tariffs, autos, okay, like whatever. So is it just a fact that he hasn't pushed Japan quite so far yet, or is this something they could expect?
I mean, it seems like expect the unexpected is definitely the way.
I mean, expecting a big existential, earth-shaking challenge.
He certainly has questioned the value of the U.S.-Japan alliance before, as recently as last week, and so, in that sense, I can't rule it out. Depending on what happens, sort of with other challenges, and maybe what approach he takes to North Korea or what approach he takes to China. I mean, that might determine what ultimately happens as far as Japan is concerned. I mean, I think there is certainly at the elite level, I think, an appreciation that Japan has to doesn't want to precipitate the crisis that it wants to avoid, and so they do have to kind of try to be patient, to get a fuller sense of what exactly Trump's intentions are, what exactly his, I don't think we really know what his administration's China policy is yet. Like it could, like it feels like it could be one extreme or the other, right? It could be like very leaning into like absolutely intense, like risking war, military confrontation, or complete accommodation. I mean, you could
the grand bargain that keeps getting floated.
Yeah, so it feels like until they really know the answer to that, there's the Japanese expression, fire on the opposite shore. I mean, clearly, they're in that kind of situation where they're watching Europe, they see what's happening in Europe, they see the implications for the international order, but it's still not quite present. The fire has not leaped into Japan's neighborhood yet. Yeah. So there's still some time. There's still some distance. Maybe the bigger question is, is there, what can Japan do to buy itself more time to do some more hedging, to do some more preparations for a world in which it actually can't assume that the United States will come to its defense. And how quickly can it do that? We're seeing Europe move with rapidity that didn't seem possible from European governments. Even just in the last week. So we will have to see what the turning point for Japan is if it comes, but they're not quite there yet.
Let's go back to private sector FDI a little bit. Because you mentioned that they're starting to raise questions. FDI may become a little bit more risky. And one of the things that I'm taking away from Doge and everything that's happened so far is, what happens to rule of law? What happens to investment law? Can you invest in the United States and have it, trust that the courts, trust that the law is going to be adjudicated as it should be? How much are Japanese companies becoming concerned about this? Is just like a yellow flag, caution flag? Is this no concern at all? Because one of the things, I'll pull Argentina out as an example. Crazy rule of law to the extent that they have it. Sorry, Argentine listeners. So not a lot of foreign investment. You pick your country. Is there a chance that can happen to the United States if this keeps going the way it's going?
I think for Japanese companies on the whole, it is still too big a market. And I think you made the point. I think you said on Blue Sky, that basically now it's like, Japanese companies have had no problem operating in an enormous market with real concerns about rule of law
and predictability,
et
cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it's right next door.
So it's maybe the Chinaization of the U.S. market. But even with the concerns about the rule of law, and with some real practical concerns, right? What sort of FARA enforcement is there going to be? What sort of foreign corrupt, all these. And that might be more to do with U.S. companies, but clearly, the state of law enforcement in the United States and the possibility of selective enforcement, and not knowing if you do violate the law that they claim they're not going to enforce, that you could be vulnerable to pressure in some way. Right. Clearly, there's more uncertainty and unpredictability. It's not. Maybe, is rule of law a spectrum, or is it like being pregnant? It's well, right. You either are or you aren't. I think the rule of law. There's probably more shades than you either have it or you don't.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, I see what you mean. And like you said, Japan is not, or Japanese firms are not completely adverse to investing in China or other countries with weak rule of law or unpredictable rule of law. But after a while, there comes to be a point where you just start asking yourself, is this really worth it? How much do these burdens and all this other stuff and whatnot? Are we anywhere close to something like that? And by close, I don't mean next week I open up Nikkei and you see something about Japanese companies turning back FDI, but within, I don't know, the remaining 3+ years of the administration. Is something you could see down the horizon?
My guess is that in the near term, it's probably less about the rule of law question and more about just what the macro outlook looks like. That really is going to shape decision making in the the immediate term. Just the possibility that you might end up with stagflation in the United States, which seems like, if not a certainty, things are certainly
heading that direction,
and the policy response from the United States is kind of iffy. So my guess would be that in the near term that's going to be a more consequential factor, affecting investment decisions than if we make this investment, are we going to get expropriated or have to deal with regulatory punishments because this, that, and the other. It does seem more that the prospect of a recession in the United States could put a real damper on investment decisions.
Yeah, so more concern about the economic outlook than the rule of law outlook, I suppose.
Yeah, I think my guess would be for right now that that's more where minds are.
Could you see, and just throwing this out as a hypothetical, could you see a method to the quote unquote madness? Like, is this analogous to, say, shock therapy in Eastern Europe in the 1990s? Is this analogous to, or is this a situation of, we got to endure some short-term pain, but once we get through that, could you see a path to something like that?
To, like, healthy growth after this?
Yes. Is this a massive readjustment? Is this the privatization of the American economy? I mean, they have just about labeled it quite literally as the privatization of the American economy.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, the question is, like, where are these people going to, like, all these laid off federal workers going to go? It's not exactly easy to absorb that kind of surge into a labor force in a pretty short period of time, especially because many of them are, like you go to the government because that's where your skills are needed.
Exactly.
No, I mean, I think, it feels, look, they've said it's like debothification. They've said,
how does that debothification work?
Yeah, exactly. Or for that matter,
how did privatization in Russia work
how did
out?
how did shock therapy in Russia work out? Like that, yeah. So
I can tell you.
It feels, I mean, and it already tells you that, that given that they want to tinker with GDP figures, to exclude, like these are not signs that, of confidence that your program is headed in the right direction, when you have to start fiddling with the numbers. I mean, I struggle to, I know there are some who think they have a strategy or think they know what they're doing, and obviously there's different factions sort of pushing and pulling.
Right.
But, I thought that interview that the Commerce Secretary Lutnick did over the weekend, I can't even figure out what it was, talking about how, he wants Americans making T-shirts and, bath towels and TVs. And it's just, is this really the goal? What, are we going to switch places with China? China's going to be the high value added, innovator of the world, and the United States is going to be the manufacturer of the world, making low cost stuff to sell everywhere. Like, what kind of vision is that? Like, what, you're going to take all these government workers and they're going to go to work in sweatshops? Like, this is not a viable plan for anything other than, pronounced domestic instability. So I struggle to discern what exactly the goal is here.
Bond yields, 10-year bond yields, reducing the debt. I'm trying, I keep trying to, the measuring stick I use is to think like 5 odd years ahead and imagine that this works out and what kinds of things you would need to see happen for this to work out. I think, like you, struggle to figure out how this could work, but, like, say you reduce the debt, say you increase GDP growth. Is that realistic, or are we just trying to rationalize chaos?
I don't see what is the growth strategy here?
We just said T-shirts and bath towels.
Right, and is that the thing that China
it's not the economy of the future?
The thing that China is throwing how much money into to try to escape from, right? To move up the value chain. Like, what kind of growth strategy moves you down the value chain? It doesn't make any sense to me. And this, what I don't understand is that we are looking at a competition for growth in the 21st century, right? Who's going to have market share in the the advanced energy technologies, mobility, AI, other
quantum computing. You can go down the list.
This is the struggle, right? And I think it's well established at this point that a lot of basic research doesn't get done by private companies and needs to be supported by governments. And
a lot of industries don't develop without subsidies.
And this administration is kneecapping the ability to do that. And so in terms of thinking about forget the short-term growth, what are the long-term engines of growth? Like, what do they see as those long-term engines of growth? And how do they envision doing that, if they've severely reduced federal capacity? It's like this like this is pretty basic stuff. It's like we've all kind of come around to the idea that industrial policy, if not perfect, can actually do some pretty important stuff, particularly when you're at the technology frontier.
Sitting in Tokyo, it's an appropriate place to bring that up. But let's bring Japan back into it as a final point. If the U.S. is committed to the trajectory that it's committed to, is there a way for Japan to help support this? Is there a way for Japanese FDI or research or what have you to sort of play a contributing factor in the next American economy? I'm trying to find the glass half full.
No,
here.
I mean, Japanese companies, have essentially been in the United States so long that they're practically American companies in so many ways, and are an important part of the manufacturing base and are researchers and innovators and within the United States, and so they'll be part of any sort of growth picture in the United States. With the United States not going completely autarkic, they're going to be, I think, part of that story, and those relationships are important, and will continue to be. But clearly, figuring out, what is the American Third Era,
that's a good comparison,
so to speak, is very hard to discern right now, and that, ultimately, like that's got to the question we've got to answer. What exactly are the drivers of growth going to be, and how do we get there? If the basic research isn't being funded, if universities are being undermined, if the talented researchers who in the past would have never thought twice about going to the United States maybe now have second thoughts, and maybe are going to other places. This is these are real questions that have to be answered.
Okay. Well, on that note, Tobias, thanks so much for joining us today. And needless to say, this is going to be an issue area that we'll be revisiting again and again and again. So hope to have you back on sometime in the future.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks. Really glad to have this conversation.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Most of us have heard of the Silk Road, but the Amber Road deserves its share of attention too. Connecting the Gulf of Finland to the Mediterranean, the Amber Road was how the civilizations of the Mediterranean and beyond secured their supply of the precious resource, amber. Amber is fossilized tree resin, or sap, and the world's primary source is the coast of the Baltic Sea, specifically the area around what's become the Prussian city of Königsberg, or modern Kaliningrad. In fact, about 90% of the world's extractable amber still comes from the Baltic states due to the location of an ancient pine forest that was eventually overtaken by the sea as the continents moved and the landscape changed. The combination of pine resin and seawater helped preserve the amber on the seafloor, where it was fossilized, and over time was kicked up by waves and cast on the seashore, where it was gathered up for use. If you accept the premise of the Silk Road as a roughly coherent route connecting Europe and China, as opposed to more diffuse connections in the lands between the East and West, then the Amber Road predates it by about 800 years, beginning around 1000 BCE. But the trade in amber goes back even further. Baltic amber was in demand as far back as the Stone Ages, with samples being found as far off as Spain around 3600 BCE. Baltic amber was found in the Temple of Apollo on the Greek island of Delphi, and was also found in the breast ornament of Egypt's Tutankhamun, making his funerary wear an ideal example of early globalization. Longtime listeners will remember that the blue stone in his funerary headdress came from Afghanistan. Baltic amber even made its way as far as the Han Dynasty in China around 200 BCE. Transportation was relatively easy, taking advantage of the Vistula and Dnieper rivers to reach the Adriatic and Black Seas, and from there to the Mediterranean and beyond. But maybe the most evocative use of amber would be the amber room that was created for the Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin in 1701, and later gifted to Tsar Peter the Great in 1716 by his ally Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia. Tsar Peter installed the amber room in the Catherine Palace outside of St. Petersburg, where it remained until it was looted by the Nazis, who dismantled it and shipped it to Königsberg to have it installed for display. But with Allied forces closing in on the city at the end of World War II, the Amber Room was disassembled yet again and put into storage. The city was destroyed by Allied bombing, and the Amber Room disappeared. By the end of its construction and the various renovations, it contained more than 13,000 pounds of amber and 990 pounds of amber panels. The Soviet Union commissioned a reconstruction in 1979, a process that took 24 years and required more than 40 experts before it reopened in 2003 in the Catherine Palace. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.